Hey everyone, today I'm sitting down with Craig Gravina to talk about the future of data management tools. Craig is the CTO of Semarchy, a 5 times champion as rated by Infotech, including most recently for the 2025 Data Quadrant Award for Master Data Management Software. I want to ask him about the state of data management right now, where he sees it going, and where Semarchy fits into the mix. Let's jump in. Craig, in the context of Semarchy and what you guys are doing, what does modern data management look like, and what does that actually mean?
Sure. Modern data management is really, I think data management is actually going into a renaissance period, right? And that's primarily being driven by the explosion of AI, right? And obviously AI, whether it's machine learning, generative AI, is fundamentally only as good as the data, right? And so it's put a renewed emphasis on MDM, right, as well as all of the other tangential aspects around that: governance, integration, and other types of master data management. So, when you look at MDM and its evolution over time, the company started in 2011. It's really kind of been something that's been in the depths of the IT organization and is now beginning to become more of a widely embraced enterprise solution because of the prevalence of a lot of things. But I think one of the things that's really going to drive this renaissance period is the advent of AI.
Right. And it's interesting. I hear a lot about how, with AI, as you kind of said, like the AI is only as good as the data underlying it. And suddenly, leaders are saying like, well, what do you mean? Like the data is not good and we can't get the AI insights that we want. As we think about how we can modernize our own data management practices and prepare organizations for that emerging technology, I mean, is that getting any easier? Like, is AI kind of a silver bullet for that unto itself? Or, what do organizations need to be thinking about and getting right as they undergo that effort?
Yeah, a number of things, Jeff. Right. I think and maybe I'll kind of progressively go
Sure.
through the stages of that. I think one of the core tenets is beginning to think about MDM as more of a first-class citizen within your enterprise engineering, IT groups.
Hmm.
And, what I mean by that is taking more of a data ops or data engineering approach to your MDM solution. Right? Typically an MDM solution has some kind of embedded modeling capability and so forth. And so you're working within the tools of the solution. Really, everybody is working within IDEs, whether it's Visual Studio, using Git, applying continuous delivery, right? Those are the modern tools that an enterprise needs in order to really embrace MDM across the enterprise. Right? And I say that for a couple of reasons. One, because these are the tools that the engineering teams are using, right? But two, and probably more importantly, is that ability to have development work around the domain models happening in different areas of the organization. Something you sometimes can't do with the current solutions that are out there. What with the approach of a data ops or data engineering approach really puts the technical teams into that familiar environment of, I'm working in my IDE.
Uh-huh.
I'm using my visual tool capability. I'm using Git for branching and merging, right? And so it really, that's kind of the fundamental aspect that begins to open up the capabilities to the enterprise, right? The next piece of modernization or beginning to embrace some of these more advanced concepts is really what people are beginning to refer to as data mesh, right? And data mesh is almost more of an organizational approach than it is an actual technology. I mean, it
Yeah.
certainly does rely upon architectural tenets and so forth, but the the data mesh concept is built around decentralization. right? And pushing the technical aspects out where the knowledge lives, right? And so what that means to an MDM solution is putting the ownership and the design of the domain models into the different areas of the organization that really understand the data, right? So, you have teams that are working on product inventory, product catalog, e-commerce systems, right? Typically, that's a whole engineering team, IT team, the business teams, they know that data best. And so allowing that domain modeling, the MDM design, the curation, right, of the data to happen there as opposed to being centralized in the IT teams facilitates a number of things. A, the knowledge, the better quality of the domain, but also the acceleration of delivering value to the organization happens quicker, right? So in order to enable that, it's fundamentally dependent upon this concept of data ops, right?
Mm.
And being able to distribute the development and be able to manage those different domain model versions, right? Or the different domains, just like you would manage different branches of software, right? Um, the other tenet of that, right, is which kind of speaks to the opposite of the mesh, right? It's almost more, a fabric approach, which is a centralized model,
Mhm.
right? Just to use some of the buzzwords, where you then can have a unified model that brings together those distributed models from the different organizations. So I really think the tools enable a lot of this collaboration across the organization. The concepts of mesh enable the organization to put ownership where the knowledge is, right? And enable the delivery of solutions. And then while still embracing some of the concepts of centralization, right? And the fabric mentality allows for a broader view of the old enterprise data ecosystem. So that's a lot to bite off first. It goes on.
If you work in IT, Infotech Research Group is a name you need to know. No matter what your needs are, Infotech has you covered. AI strategy? Covered. Disaster recovery? Covered. Vendor negotiation? Covered. Infotech supports you with the best practice research and a team of analysts standing by, ready to help you tackle your toughest challenges. Check it out at the link below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. As you were talking, Craig, I mean, I thought, as you were going that, you were making a pretty compelling sell for, this kind of embedded, data management structure, within the, living as close to the the business units as possible. And then you started talking about kind of this more, centralized fabric approach. Is it both? Is it and or? What are you guys seeing and what are you recommending as best practice?
Yeah, they definitely are not mutually exclusive concepts. It is really both. Now, I mean, you don't have to have both. And I think in terms of, um, you know, if you are embracing these concepts, I think the most powerful one is the mesh concept of
Mhm.
enabling the domain knowledge at the edge, if you will, right,
Yeah.
where it lives. The value of the combination, I think the data governance aspect is a really good use case, right? Where um, you may want to be able to have your domain ownership at the departmental level, but you really want to manage governance, right?
Mm.
What my privacy, my regulatory compliance, being able to have a purview of data lineage across the enterprise and the various domains that are consuming it. In some cases, there's a lot of value to that being more centralized in
Right.
nature and controlled at a from a single source of truth, right? Um, it gets blurry though because you can also make the argument that a federated model of governance, which kind of uses both tenets, right, if you will. Right,
Mhm.
I'm centralizing my core governance aspects. Let's use data privacy because intimately familiar from my healthcare days. You may have multiple operating companies, operating groups within an organization. Maybe one of them is dealing with clinical care. Maybe one of them is dealing with medical devices, right? Those two organizations are going to have different privacy regulation, different requirements in terms of protecting data, especially the clinical team who's going to really have to deal with personal health information. So centralizing the core aspect of governance, privacy governance might be that I need to protect PII, but I
Mhm.
want to be able to federate that ownership down to the individual operating units because my clinical care organization wants to also add the PHI, the personal health information aspects to the privacy policies as well. So, you know, it really is there. You need to think of these things in tandem. And I
Yeah.
think the combinations, begin to address some of the more advanced use cases. But I'll kind of go back to, I think the fundamental shift that's most powerful that people can make is this concept of the mesh or distributed ownership, distributing the ability to produce data products and allow self-service from the other groups. That really can only be accomplished through underlying technology
Yeah.
like a data ops model, right? And so, in my mind, that's kind of the first thing on a road to MDM maturation, if you will, right? That an enterprise could embrace.
So that's exactly where I wanted to go next, Craig, which is, as we think about self-service and as we think about the tools themselves, it sounds like the tools are enabling us to push more and more than ever before to the business users, maybe even to, dare I call them like the non-technical folks here. Are you seeing more of that? And do you have any, do you have any sense of where that's going and, what organizations are starting to do there?
Yeah, this is always this is a lively internal debate, right? That we frequently
Yeah.
have, right? And I think that if you kind of look at the progression of data management, it kind of for the most part started off, and I think until recently was more an attempt to enable some business users to leverage the solutions, right? And
Mhm.
so what you wound up with was halfway solutions, right?
Yeah.
That allowed a business user to visually draw domains, to be able to set rules and workflows, but weren't quite powerful enough for the real engineering user. Um, so as we have been really embracing this data ops concept, right, and building out the tools to think about it from an data ops or data engineering up perspective, there is frequently a debate. What about the business user, right?
Yeah.
And are we forgetting the business user as we make that progression? I think there's going to need to be both, right? I
Yeah.
think the real question is what is the use case for the business user as it relates to some of the more technical aspects related to domain modeling, workflows, etc. And I think there's a room for both of those to play. I think it's a matter as this is the beginning, right, of this
Yeah.
shift. And I think, there's a bit of guesswork happening until we start to see how data ops influences that environment, right?
Well, and the vibe I'm getting from you is kind of a cautious attitude toward, pushing too much toward, the end business user. And, we've actually had this debate internally too among our analysts. And one of the perspectives was something similar. It was like, yes, you could, but should you? Because, to your point, you know, maybe they can have point solutions or things that kind of work in a vacuum, but you need someone with their hand on the wheel who actually understands kind of the broader, architecture implications. Is that, do you buy that?
I think it really depends, right? I mean, it's not a cut and dry answer, right?
Mhm.
Because you could take this from the lens of what is the actual profile of the enterprise, right? I mean, you're going to have plenty of organizations that are smaller entities
Mhm.
that may not even have a significant IT team, right? Let alone
Mhm.
engineering resources out at a
Sure.
departmental level, or an engineering team that is. departmentally focused, right? And in those cases, I think you will have to have solutions that enable business users or a lower technical skill user an ability to implement MDM, right? The the there's, I think, use cases where you still want a hybrid of that as well.
Yeah.
The Certainly our solutions currently address both. The question is, where do you invest? Because it becomes difficult. The technical challenge underlying that is the more data ops, the more technical you go, the more difficult it is to maintain a parallel capability in the WYSIWYG, no
Yeah.
code type of environments, right? So are fundamentally, I think we have to address both. I think there are different implementations of solutions based upon the market you're addressing. Right now, we have solutions that are very focused on being able to hit those less engineering capable organizations. And so a lot of our investment and focus right now is continuing to expand our data ops capabilities so we can
Mhm.
validate the model, and that is in fact where the value prop is going to be realized around that data ops concept.
So let's dig a little bit deeper into data ops for a minute. For organizations that don't have a data ops function right now, or are starting to think about one for the first time, what guidance would you give them? What questions should they be asking about whether this data ops model is right for them?
I think the for I th- so if I look at data ops in the data engineering context as, this is software engineering, 10, 15, 20 years ago,
Mhm.
right? Moving to agile development methodologies, moving to continuous integration and continuous deployment, right? Being able to deliver value quickly, right? The That's the same evolution that, what has been more very data engineering focused on doing integrations, right,
Mhm.
is going to take, my belief within that data ops concept. So if I was giving advice to an organization that is thinking about embracing this, which is obviously going to likely be an organization that's familiar with engineering, traditional software engineering, is to look at the parallels, right? And look at the past history of adoption of the agile methodologies, the ability to do DevOps, and think about how that applies to their data organization or the resources that are focused there. And so I think that's also an opportunity for the engineering teams to be more closely associated with the data teams as well, and almost could serve as mentors, right, to these
Mhm.
teams. And I think that the benefit an organization gains there is that then the solutions that the engineering teams are building are contemplating a lot of the concepts that are going to make the data ops teams lives easier and ability to deliver more value.
Right. So similar to that, what are you seeing organizations get wrong as they go down the data ops road, or don't go down the data ops road? Like as they're in this kind of data engineering space, do you see any examples or any stories where you're like, oh, like that is not an approach that's going to serve you well? And do you have any kind of recommended remedies?
Yeah, I think the pitfall or the trap you can fall into is to think of this as just another tool for your existing teams or
Mm,
your existing methodologies, right? Um, it's real easy to say, okay, I'm going to adopt data ops, and the team who has been working traditionally is just going to still stay isolated and use the tools in the same model, right?
mm,
Um, and I think, and this maybe goes back to some of the business concept. I think uh, approaching that data ops as purely a technical aspect, right, doesn't doesn't do it justice either. So I if if you're only thinking IT, you're just going to have a better IT oriented solution. If you're thinking about this from the business use case, and I'll just as an example use that more distributed model. If I'm thinking about this as to how do I enable us to have domain ownership And even if it's still the IT team that may be doing initial adoption, but to begin working across those different domains and in parallel with the business user, the use case as to why that's valuable, that's where I think you're really going to begin to touch on some of the benefit that this model begins to expose. The I think that's it's an imperative to it may be more painful. The learning curve
Mm.
is hard, but it's easy to fall into the trap of this is just a better tool for my IT teams to use.
So there's a structural shift that's required, and it sounds like a mindset shift required as well.
And I really think that's the way that an organization should go about this is thinking about it from the organizational perspective, the adoption, the ethos of the company, right? Being data oriented um, before they before they really attack the project, right? Um, it it is just as much, if not more, a company culture and ethos of thinking about your data ops like you think about software. You know, when we
Mm.
build software, right? We think about what's the value prop. What are we delivering? What's the incremental value we can deliver? Right. And you take small chunks and you incrementally deliver in an agile model, right? That's the same model. You need to be thinking about what's an MVP? How do I get the business user? How do I test this quickly? And I think that kind of adoption, that approach to it is what will gain adoption across the organization. Going about this as I'm going to have a gigantic project that I can now manage with Git, right, and source
Yeah.
control, so it can be huge, right? Is it's that's you're going to have a long time to realizing value, and then that's going to stifle the adoption.
Yeah. Have you gone through this journey as a CTO, Craig, and what was that like?
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier my past history has been on the healthcare side, healthcare
Mhm.
enterprise software, working in clinical research, working with providers. You know, the holy grail of healthcare is bringing together data around the patient
Mhm.
from whatever care setting they were at, hospitals, different providers, different clinics. You know, all of those systems have, a different concept of a patient ID, right? You know, the simplest one. And how do you do patient matching across the systems? How do you harmonize what the actual domain is in terms of the care delivery and being able to, ultimately in healthcare, they talk about getting to a longitudinal view of the patient care over their lifespan. And that's only possible by addressing the kinds of things that we address in the MDM space. We just never called it MDM, right?
Right.
We just thought about it in terms of the challenge, and we built our own tooling to do it, right? I mean, I look back retrospectively and said, Why didn't I think about leveraging some of the solutions that were in the market on some of these things?" Um, so I've applied the concepts in a number of different organizations. I've done it a little bit more from the we're going to solve the engineering challenge,
Mm.
right? The so It definitely was heavy lifting, right? And I think that's part of what has attracted me to one of the things that has attracted me to Semarchy, right, has been the concept of being able to solve these big challenges that ultimately yield huge value. Bringing together that longitudinal record, you need that to be able to solve the big problems of how can I better diagnose
Yeah.
and predict cancer rates, right? How can I predict a care pathway and deliver the most effective care? So, you look at what we're doing from an enterprise software perspective with Semarchy, it's enabling the solving of those big problems. Right. So that was one piece that really attracted me to what I'm doing right now. The other piece, right, is the implications that all of this has to AI, right, and the progression of delivering AI solutions in a more production and professionalized orientation. And so I know we've been kind of talking about a lot of the
Mhm.
MDM concepts. I really think the other half of that renaissance, right, or the golden age of MDM is going to be applying the same concepts towards the way people think about their AI ecosystem within the enterprise.
So let's talk about that AI ecosystem for a minute. What does that look like? And, how does it intersect with these data management tools? And, what does it unlock if you get it right?
I'm glad you asked, Jeff. the here so here's been the eye opener for me. Initially, I came into this thinking, well, it's data and the value of clean data and golden records and being able to have AI ready data is the value.
Mm.
Right? And having done a lot of work, in the AI space, initially I was thinking, okay, I get it. Right. The more I dug in, though, the deeper it got. Right. So if you think of, we say MDM, it really is a broad category. Right? It's the domain management, it's the governance, it's the integration, right? It's being able to track data lineage and provenance and all of the other things, privacy. So that concept of MDM has kind of become a big placeholder for what is a lot of things. But even if you just boil it down to data management, governance, and integration, right, which is kind of the core categories people talk about, those same concepts apply to your AI ecosystem in very much a same parallel. I need to have a catalog of models. And this is where I think the industry is going, right? I need a catalog of my models. I need to be able to manage metadata around my model. I need to not only know that I have clean and good data for training of my models, but I need to be able to track that lineage all the way from source to actual training and model production, right? And understanding the lineage of that data and being able to produce some degree of explainability in a model, right? I mean, those are going to become fundamental tenets to reducing risk of an organization deploying AI-based solutions out into the market. The concept of integration, right? The integration, whether it's from upstream of the source coming down into analytics, lakes, warehouses, whatever it is, you really can think of the same concepts in terms of flowing data integration down into the AI pipelines, right? And into the tooling and the mechanics that the data science teams are using in order to service the development of models, right? Whether that be golden record data or synthetic data, or I think one of the other concepts that people need to be aware of as they do these kinds of integrations or bringing the ecosystem together, is also the concept of how clean is the data I'm delivering. I think there's an easy trap there, right? It's easy. And I think everybody goes to, I want clean quality data. That's the source of truth. Well, that's great, but that doesn't necessarily give you what you need to train a model. You want outliers. You want the
Right.
same kind of errors that a human makes in data, right? So there's another concept here, I think, that is understanding how data quality and curation potentially impacts your models downstream as well. And that's just, I think, the tip of the iceberg, right? But just like enterprises, whether you're the CIO or the CDO, the CTO, need to worry about the regulatory impacts, the privacy impacts of their data, even more so, in order for us to realize the true value of AI, need to be thinking about how AI potentially exposes them to risk from a privacy perspective. How trustful is this data, right? Is it biased? Where you can, am I overfitting it because I
Hmm.
cleaned it too much? Right. So, when you look at what has gone on through the life cycle and progression of master data management as a broad category, we're only at I mean, it's going exponentially, right? The value of
Hmm.
what AI can deliver. But I think we are at a point where there's also a tremendous amount of risk, and the enterprise needs to also begin thinking about it in a more production oriented, professional, you know, trust privacy risk-oriented approach.
So where does a bunch of stuff there I'm very interested in diving deeper into. That was really interesting. Specifically though, as we look at, maturing these capabilities, how does an organization like Semarchy come into play here? And what's the advantage of, using data tools versus, kind of going it alone and doing it manually?
The advantage of being involved with a group like us, I'll be a little selfish, for a second, is we really are trying to take a fresh approach at how we play in the overall enterprise ecosystem. Um, I mean, this is very nascent stuff, and while it's easy to pontificate on how this all plays out together, there's not a lot of people doing it today, right? Um, you know, One of the things that I'm really excited about in terms of the customer base that Semarchy has in place is, there's a lot of loyal customers. And the company has been historically very collaborative with the clients and, view the delivery of success and value as an integral part of delivering the solution, not just here's our software, license it. Right. So that just sets up a really great environment of collaboration to uncover where the value of these kinds of approaches is, and also validate it. Right. So I think the benefit that, to your question of why would a company want to work with us is, we realize that the future is still unclear. Right. One of the things that I think is just tremendously important for companies that are delivering emerging solutions, disruptive solutions, or a transition in the market like what is happening with MDM is to be honest about where the maturity of your solution is. I have seen a lot of software companies, be very aggressive about what they can deliver, and ultimately, you come short of the expectations. I think the benefit of being open about where your innovation pipeline is, the maturity of your product, is not just ethical, but it opens up that ability to collaborate with your customers, right? Being able to say, yeah, we really believe in this concept of MDM and AI being closely tied together, but we don't really yet know what that means in terms of how to track data lineage, right?
Right.
You know, we know how we do it today. We think we know how we want to do it. So let us work with you to try to figure out how to solve that problem. So, I think we have a grounding in a lot of success. Our solutions have been extremely well received. We've got a lot of great customers, and I think the opportunity for a group like us is that close collaboration and the speed of innovation.
As I hear you talking about that, Craig, it sounds like, you're not, for better or for worse, you're not, standing on your soapbox saying like, I know what the future looks like. It's more like, we don't know what the future looks like, but we know what types of things you need to do today to be best positioned for, wherever that's going to go. Is that fair?
I think it's a very fair statement. Um, I'd like to think there's a bit of, but we think we might know.
Well, so let's talk about that then. Where where
But
where
we
do
think
you?
we might know where it's going, and we're willing to experiment, right?
Yeah.
And
So where
so
do you think it's going?
well, I mean, I really do think the concept set we've been talking about in this last part of the conversation is where it's going, is the blend of what's traditionally been thought of as MDM.
Mhm.
And in some cases, I think historically it's like, oh yeah, it's MDM. It's down in the IT team and
Yeah.
it's data models and whatnot. Um, I think it's where it's going is that it is, the realization is happening, right? I mean, this is not something other people aren't thinking about.
Yeah.
The the criticality of data to your ability to leverage AI and the criticality of the concepts and the tenets of what we've used in MDM, right, traditionally, to thinking about how you productionize AI in your organization, are just so closely knit, right? I mean, again, like I said, I came into the organization thinking, hey, wow, this is, we're going to solve the problems of just giving good data. And I think, what's opened my eyes has been, as I've dug in more and more to the MDM space, the importance that the not just the data, but the concepts of governance and quality and lineage and the ability to integrate into the tool sets and so forth, the pipelines, that's where I think the future is going to be. Ultimately, if I took, and just to really think big,
Yeah.
for a second, I think you could potentially apply the same concepts to your internal API ecosystem. I mean, there's no reason why you might not think about, I need a catalog of my internal services that I'm exposing to the rest of my engineering organization in the enterprise. And how do I govern access to that? And how do I make sure that my APIs are not leaking data and privacy and so forth? So, really, I think where this all goes is a the potential of thinking about your entire ecosystem, whether that be data, API, or AI, right, as a
Mhm.
solution that's managed with professionalism around the organization and is able to deliver value, quickly, but with certainty and reduce risk.
Yeah. So as we go, as we think, even a little bit bigger about, what the implications for organizations of all of this is, I'm finding myself coming back to like the healthcare example, and we talk about like, getting to this North Star of longitudinal integrated patient data and, everything that opens up. And I mean, I'm going to take a stab in the dark, Craig, and say that, even in your, amazing and illustrious tenure as a CTO in healthcare, like we probably didn't 100% implement that vision because it's so meaty and it's so tricky. Are we now in striking distance with some of these tools of being able to implement these things we've been talking about for so long?
Yeah, absolutely. We are. And it's being done. I mean, in the last couple of years, there are there is good tooling. I It's the success that I've seen in the healthcare space has not been through tools, right? It's been through startups and ventures that
Mhm.
are taking on the burden of delivering that unified data set as a product,
Mm.
right? So it's not perfect, but it's what I've seen as being some of the more successful capabilities, right? Um, I think that'll shift to where, as the tooling like we are working on becomes available, that will shift to more internal capabilities. Um, I think there's a role to play for both of those things. I think the difference between looking at healthcare versus an internal organization is you have to manage your data. You're the producer and consumer of the data. Whereas in healthcare, solving those problems have come from third parties aggregating data from across, the healthcare ecosystem. Um, and that's really feeding a lot of the promise of AI. So the model is there. I don't think you're going to buy data as a service necessarily for your own enterprise, but buying the ability to manage your data as a service,
Mm.
obviously, is gonna help realize some of this as well.
No, that's really cool. And it's so exciting to hear about some of these kind of, up and comers and the technology that exists today that, maybe didn't even exist 6 months ago and, what it unlocks for some of these organizations.
Yeah.
What
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the potential that AI has and its dependency on the data is changing the world, right? The what we need to do now is, the proof of concept is over, right? We've proven, and it continues to prove itself exponentially every day. Now we have to be able to do it with trust, right? With confidence, and an ability to realize the value outside of the science lab,
Yeah.
right? Is what's really gonna allow the enterprise to take advantage of things.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's super, super exciting. Hey, Craig, I wanted to ask you, what's your best advice for CTOs, for CDOs, taking this journey now to, get them on the road to success?
In my mind, the best thing to do is to think of things as proof of concept, proof of value today, right? I mean, there is, of course, people are obviously solving this solution in their enterprise, but think of a parallel effort of how do I take some small bites at adopting these new methodologies, these new tools? How do I take some small bites at how that feeds into my AI pipelines? Um, we talked about it earlier. We're all kind of learning as
Mhm.
we're flying the plane here, right? So minimize some of the initial risk, right? I think that's of adoption. Minimize, the um, it's gonna it's emerging, right? Run it in parallel with your current efforts so that you're not head placing all of your bets on something that may be very nascent at this stage, and keep taking bites at the apple.
Nice. Do you have any kind of war stories or success stories you can share about, whether it's customers, whether it's, your own experience about, what are some of the cool use cases, or as we look at some of these cool proofs of concept, what people are doing out there?
I think so. We didn't even touch on AI within MDM, right? We talked about how MDM is going to
Well, so
feed
let's maybe
feed
start with
AI.
AI in MDM then, because that is
Yeah,
something I wanted to talk about, and I feel like we just scratched the surface.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we glossed over it, right?
Yeah,
Completely.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The but I think this is feeds into the previous question a bit too. When you so typically the scenario that you contemplate or that's being used today that we're using today, right, is thinking about enrichers, right? How
Mhm.
do I make my data better, more meaningful, richer, hence
Yeah.
the enricher. Right. There's some really low hanging fruit there in terms of leveraging the large language models and generative AI. Right. Um, being able to enhance product description, being able to, do better matching, right, across whether it's customer or addresses or whatnot with AI. Clearly that's an easy use case to approach, right? The classification of your data is another really great one that we're doing, in terms of looking at metadata, trying to catalog it, queuing it up for curation. Right. So a lot of the use cases that we are attacking right now are in the context of augmentation, right? So augmenting humans to make them more productive, right? And in a lot of these cases, it is augmenting the data steward. Right?
Mm.
Here is better data. Here is better um, enriched data. Approve it, right? That
Yeah.
concept. Until confidence is gained. Right? Here's classification of data. Do you agree? The That's great. We're doing that today. The Where I think in product AI is going is in agentive workflows, right? And the ability for agents doing the work
Mhm.
for those
Sure.
that don't know what agentive is, and executing workflows amongst each other, right? So, for a data quality agent, right, to be able to queue up, here are some quality anomalies and bounce them off of another agent that may be in the use case of I want to absorb some anomalies into my AI pipeline. And so let me look at that and determine whether it should flow through. those are the kinds of things that humans would need to spend tedious amounts of time to manage, and may not be able to do it as effectively. So I think the future of in product, right, AI for MDM is going to be about making the productivity of the organization in achieving these concepts easier, better, more
Yeah.
cost effective.
Yeah, and as you kinda got at, like, it's in the whole, like, bucket of, like, QA, there's a lot of, like, really grindy work that, like, fingers crossed may just, like, go away.
Yeah. So, well, QA in terms of engineering or QA around your data? Uh,
Well, I mean, let me throw it back at you. I mean, my thought was, my thought was both, but we can tease those apart.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, QA around your engineering and models and things of that nature, right? Whether it's software or your integrations. Yeah, that absolutely. There's use case
Mhm.
there. We're using some of those use cases in the engineering level, the software
Yeah.
engineering level. The ability to QA with automation of test cases, synthetic data, absolutely, right? Um, the more interesting and difficult use cases are the quality assurance on the data,
Mm.
right? Um, and actually, this is what I've been finding is the relevance of healthcare to this space has just been tremendous. I mean, I think actually healthcare has had to solve some of these bigger problems,
Yeah.
right? So, one of the previous organizations I was involved with was focused on clinical trials, and there is an aspect of clinical trials. It's not the same thing, but it is called data management,
Yep.
right? It is not the MDM like we think of it. And what that is humans reviewing the data, the clinical outcomes that are being captured throughout the clinical trial in order to make sure that it's clinically relevant and accurate and supporting, the overall, thesis around the therapeutic. They do that manually by looking for
Mhm.
the anomalies. So, I have experience using AI and agentive workflows to do that work for them, right? And there's a lot of potential there. I think again, it's the concept of we need to start with augmentation and humans in the middle,
Mhm.
right? And as confidence grows, to be able to partition some of that off to the agents themselves.
What's your take on synthetic data?
I love synthetic data. I love synthetic data. Synthetic data is great because it reduces all the risk, right?
Mm,
Let me go
sure.
generate a ton of synthetic data for the data scientists to go use, and I don't necessarily have to be as concerned about what I'm delivering to
The
them.
privacy piece and,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
At the same time, synthetic data can massively, lead to overfitting of a model.
That's exactly where I
Yeah.
was going, right? Like, do you lose the anomalies and some of the, like, interesting nuggets in that world?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's just as much of a challenge and a value prop that, you know, is some of the, I don't want to say low hanging, but some of the fruit, right, to be
Yeah.
captured here.
Yeah.
How do you generate synthetic data that is most meaningful based upon the profile of your data ecosystem, right? And I think again, that's where this concept of having the full spectrum from multiple sources, and the way you think about master data and governance and lineage and provenance and metadata through the whole pipeline, right? Whether you're using that for production data or trying to generate synthetic data that replicates that same process. I mean, look, the real secret sauce for the data that's used for training sets is a lot of it's in the metadata. How was the
Mhm.
data used, right? It's not just the data. It is the fact that it was used at this end source system in the context of this workflow, and we're going to accomplish this task, right? And that's where the real gold is. Right. So being able to, a lot of the approach that most, data science teams take is give me an export of the data, and they
Mhm.
lose all of that context. Right. So again, I think this concept of a unified approach to not just your data ecosystem, but your AI ecosystem is really going to be where there's a lot of interesting things.
Yeah. No, it's a super, super exciting space, and it's a super, super exciting time for all things data management too.
Absolutely.
Craig, thanks so much for today. This has been really great.